A letter from Richard Rodgers, great American composer of such Broadway hits as Pal Joey, South Pacific, Oklahoma, and many, many others. George loved to play the piano. He played marvelously, and on the least provocation. Performing was like a shot of adrenaline to George. He loved to be the life of the party, could entertain for hours at a stretch. Nor was his performing limited to the piano. He was a great storyteller, had a natural gift for dancing, and demonstrated no little talent as an actor. He liked being the star. I remember once going to a costume party at which he and I dressed as two of the Marx Brothers. George, of course, was the flamboyant Groucho. If parties gave Gershwin an additional platform for his considerable talents and a forum for his original and intriguing ideas, they were also the perfect showcase for a personality that helped to give New York in the 20s so much of the character we have come to associate with those years. Some of the best parties were given by Jules Glasner, vice president of Cartier's and the supreme host to the celebrities of the day. The array of talent at one of those affairs was an embarrassment of riches. Fred and Adele Astaire were regulars, as were Florence Ziegfeld, Charlie Chaplin, and Noel Coward. Often, George would be at one piano, with Cole Porter at the other, and Gertrude Lawrence would sing and B. Lilly would clown. These were wonderful parties, and George was always in attendance. Perhaps my most vivid recollection of Gershwin was Christmas Eve of 1934. My wife, Dorothy, was expecting our younger child, Linda, and was having a difficult time of it. So, she had been ordered to stay in bed until the baby's arrival. Now, George must have known how the hours dragged for Dorothy, cooped up in a New York apartment during the gayest season of the year. So that night, before Christmas, he and composer Kay Swift burst in on us like two irrepressible magi, bearing a present that only George could have given. George and I, he, in typically ebullient mood, carried Dorothy into the living room and settled her on the sofa. Our 4-year-old daughter Mary was romping around the lighted Christmas tree. A fire burned in the fireplace, and so did one burn on the end of George's ever-present cigar. When the scene was set to his satisfaction, George paused until the suspense in the room mounted to a sufficient pitch, and then he sat down at the piano and he proceeded to play the entire score of Porgy and Bess. It was a month before its Broadway premiere. He also sang his brother's Ira lyrics, in a funny voice, to be sure, but with all the emotional depth of a Caruso, at least. We knew him to be a prodigious painter, and my wife asked George if he had ever taken painting lessons. He told her that he enjoyed painting, painted well enough, and therefore saw no reason to take lessons. I personally think that it was a point of pride with him that he painted as well as he did without formal lessons. He was fond of saying that if he had pursued painting rather than music, he would have been just as accomplished an artist as he was a pianist and a composer. The fact was that he had excellent and instinctive taste. He owned a magnificent Chagall, long before Chagall was prized. He collected some enviable post-impressionists simply because they appealed to him, and when they were priced at a fraction of their worth today. Undeniably, he had an eye for quality, just as he had an ear for it. George recognized the good in art as readily as he did in music, his own or anyone else's. His passing came as a shock to all of us who knew him, of course. But to Ira, the blow was stunning both personally and professionally. The partnership of the two brothers had been so close that for a time, it seemed as though Ira would not work again. But 4 years later, he joined Kurt Weill to do the exciting and innovative Lady in the Dark. And he went on to write material for a number of very successful films and plays during the 40s. George was the gregarious firebrand member of the Gershwin team. And it is interesting that with the enormous body of work he produced, from the scores for the stage and film to concert and symphonic music, the best way to sum up George Gershwin is simply to say, Old Arlen, great American songwriter of such tunes as Only a Paper Moon, Stormy Weather, I've Got the World on a String, called to say, the whole that was the Gershwins was exemplified by the conjunction of their words and music. But it was not by any means limited to that. It involved almost every aspect of their radically different personalities. It was their differences, in fact, that made each a supportive complement to the other in ways that might not have been possible with two people of more similar chemistry. In appearance, work habits, outlook, interest, they were opposites. George, open, exuberant, a party-goer, loving the spotlight, an irrepressible performer, restless, physically active. Ira, withdrawn, shy, a mediator, slow-moving, an underplayer. Yet they functioned together with the smoothness of a beautifully oiled machine. While Ira worked in solitude, George's nature led him to compose surrounded by socializing friends or members of the family. Occasionally, when the conflict between creativity and geniality became too great, George would move to the solitude of a hotel room. And even then, his friends were apt to intrude on his work. But because he was constantly at the piano, whether actively composing or simply playing, usable phrases flowed through his fingertips in a steady stream, and he had the facility to develop them quickly, just as Ira could reach back into the storeroom of titles and ideas. There was an evening in 1937 when they were working on the score for a film, A Damsel in Distress. George typically was out at a party. Ira typically was home reading. At 1 a.m., George returned from the party, took off his dinner jacket, sat down at the piano. "How about some work?" he said to Ira. "Got any ideas?" "Well," said Ira, putting down his book, "there's one spot we might do something about a fog. How about a foggy day in London, or maybe a foggy day in London town?" "Ha! I like it better with town," replied George, and he started into a melody. An hour later, the brothers had finished the words and music for the chorus of A Foggy Day in London Town. The next day, the song still sounded good, so they began to work on the verse. Lady Mountbatten remembers. The show, Lady Be Good, also started the strange and steady hegira of one of Gershwin's most brilliant songs. George had written the now famous chorus as the verse of the song before he left for England to do Primrose in 1924. But he was dissatisfied with the relationship of this verse to its chorus. The verse was more interesting than the chorus, giving the song a top-heavy, anticlimactic feeling. So he moved the verse into the chorus position and wrote a new verse, and Ira supplied the lyrics. When Lady Be Good opened its tryout run in Philadelphia, Adele Astaire sang The Man I Love in the opening scene, but she sang it for only a week. The producer insisted on dropping it because it was too static, slowing down the show before it got started. In those days, the sheet music of a show's songs was printed and on sale in the lobby, even at an out-of-town tryout. So, when Lady Mountbatten, who had heard George playing The Man I Love in London, found that it had been published, she asked George to autograph a copy for her. She took it back to London, turned it over to the Berkeley Square Orchestra, one of her favorite bands, and soon The Man I Love was being played by orchestras all over London. From London, it spread to Paris, where it became equally popular. However, The Man I Love never found a home in a Gershwin show. It remains today as Gershwin's singular gift to popular American music. A letter from the choreographer, George Balanchine. I went to California to make my first movie in America. Samuel Goldwyn was the boss, and he arranged a conference at which I met George and Ira. My English was poor then, and Goldwyn spoke English with such an accent that we could not communicate easily. So George Gershwin tried to be the interpreter, and he spoke to me like this: "Me Tarzan, you Jane." It was such a crazy English. Who knew what he was saying? Unfortunately, George died before we finished the film, The Goldwyn Follies of 1938. However, the show contained the last song George Gershwin ever wrote. Edward G. Robinson, good friend and fellow New Yorkers, dropped by. George Gershwin had made that Beverly Hills house distinguished. After he came to Hollywood for a picture with Fred Astaire, the industry, dimly recognizing George's potential, would not let him go. Harold Arlen, Oscar Levant were always regular visitors. Indeed, I never went to a dinner at the Gershwin home when Oscar Levant was not a guest. Arnold Schoenberg came often to play tennis. And there they were, Schoenberg and Gershwin, with only a tennis net between them, two of the most discussed musicians alive. It was a sight I enjoyed. George, who had made a respectable woman out of jazz, opposed to that small, agile, older man who was beating new paths through the musical wilderness. There they were, those two contrasting giants of music, George Gershwin and Arnold Schoenberg, united in one common thought: to make a little ball scale the top of the net as though nothing else mattered. Let short-sighted humanity sneer at dissonance. Love 15. Let them call Rhapsody in Blue a mere fad. 15 all. Let them walk out grimacing and holding their ears. 30-15. Let them say Tin Pan Alley once, Tin Pan Alley always. 40-15. So Boris Morris thinks that their Klach der Nacht would make a swell picture score. 40-30. Let them speak of Porgy and Bess as a musical dwarf if it makes them happy. Game and set, 6-2. But get Schoenberg away from his tennis and ask him about George, and you would hear him say, serious or not, George Gershwin is a composer, a man who lives in music because it is his native language. There are a number of serious composers who learn to add notes together, but they are only serious because they lack humor. Beyond doubt, that George Gershwin is an innovator. What he has with rhythm, harmony, and melody is not merely style. It is fundamentally different from the mannerism of many a serious composer. His melodies are not the product of a combination, nor a mechanical union, but they are units, and therefore could not be taken to pieces. Melody, harmony, and rhythm are not welded together, but cast. In Paris, George called on Maurice Ravel to see if he could take him as a pupil. Ravel assured him that it was much better to be a first-class Gershwin than a second-class Ravel. A witty but true story concerns Gershwin's asking to study with Stravinsky. Stravinsky countered by asking Gershwin's yearly income. On being given a six-figure sum, Stravinsky said, "Why don't I study with you?" Of the I Sing opened in New York on December the 26th, 1931, with George Gershwin conducting the premiere performance. With veteran politicians Al Smith and Jimmy Walker in attendance, the Gershwin work presents a taut and lethal satire of national politics. It was funnier than government and not nearly so dangerous. The greatest salute of all came on May the 2nd, 1932, when Of Thee I Sing won the coveted Pulitzer Prize for Drama. With remarkable courage, the selection committee chose this musical and made Ira Gershwin the first lyricist to get the award. It would be 18 years before Richard Rodgers would win another Pulitzer for a Broadway musical. However, George did receive a nomination for an Academy Award for the best song of Shall We Dance in 1937. The film had the winning combination of Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers, and the marvelous Gershwins. Now, in those days, 10 songs were nominated instead of the present 5 that we have today. The orchestra played all 10 and wound up the medley with the Gershwin offering Recollections of Reuben Mamoulian. Noted film director Reuben Mamoulian had directed the Theatre Guild production of Du Bois Hayward's play Porgy, and had known George Gershwin for several years before he signed the contract to direct the Gershwin opera Porgy and Bess. He said, "I finally arrived in New York, and on the first evening I was to hear George's score, I met George and Ira in the Gershwin apartment. All three of us were very excited. George and Ira were obviously very anxious for me to like the music. It was rather amusing how all three of us were trying to be nonchalant and poised that evening, yet we were trembling with excitement. The brothers handed me a tall highball, put me in a comfortable leather armchair. George sat at the piano while Ira stood over him like a guardian angel. George's hands went up in the air, and he was about to strike the shining keys. Halfway down, he stopped, changed his mind, turned to me and said, 'Of course, Reuben, you must understand, it is very difficult to play this score. As a matter of fact, it's really impossible. Can you play Wagner on the piano? Well, this is just like Wagner.' I assured George that I understood. Up went his nervous hands again, and the next second I was listening to the opening piano music of the opera. I found it so exciting, so full of color, and so provocative in its rhythm, that after this first piano section was over, I jumped out of my armchair, interrupted George to tell him how much I liked it. Both brothers were as happy as children to hear words of praise, though heaven knows they should have been used to it by then. When my explosion was over, they went back to the piano. They both blissfully closed their eyes before they continued with the lovely Summertime song. George played with the most beatific smile on his face. He seemed to float on the waves of his own music with the southern sun shining on him. Ira sang. He threw his head back with abandon, his eyes closed, and he sang like a nightingale. In the middle of the song, George couldn't bear it any longer, took over the singing from him. To describe George's face while he sang Summertime is something that is beyond my capacity as a writer. Nirvana might be the word. So it went on. George was the orchestra, sang half the parts. Ira sang the other half. Ira was also frequently the audience. It was touching to see how he, while singing, would become so overwhelmed with admiration for his brother that he would look at me, and with half-opened eyes and pantomime, with a soft gesture of his hand, as if to say, he did it. Isn't he wonderful? Isn't he wonderful? George would frequently take his eyes from the score, covertly watch me and my reaction to the music, while pretending that he wasn't really doing it at all. It was very late into the night before we finished the opera, and sometimes I think that in a way, that was the best performance of it I ever heard. We all felt exultantly happy. The next morning, both George and Ira had completely lost their voices. For 2 days, they couldn't talk. They only whispered. I shall never forget that evening. The enthusiasm of the two brothers about their music, their anxiety to do it justice, their joy at it being appreciated with all their touching devotion to each other. It is one of those rare, tender memories one cherishes in life. A letter from Todd Duncan, the original Porgy in the world premiere of Porgy and Bess on Broadway. George Gershwin was going around the country looking for his Porgy. When they told him that I was teaching, he said that he didn't want any university professor to sing. But he'd been going to different nightclubs all over the country, and he told me that he had heard 100 Negro baritones in a year's time. So he called me and asked if I would come and sing for him. I wasn't very interested. I was teaching at Howard University, and I thought of George Gershwin as being Tin Pan Alley and something beneath me. So I told him that I couldn't come that Sunday because I was singing in a little church where I was soloist. And I refused the wonderful man whom I came to love and revere. I said that I could come the next Sunday. So the next Sunday I went to New York, and I went to his apartment at 1 p.m. He came to the door himself and asked, "Where's your accompanist?" "Can't you play?" I asked. "Well, I can play a little," he said. "I can play for myself," I said. "I'll try to play for you. I'll try," he said. I put a piece on the piano. "What's this?" he wants to know. "This is an old Italian song, a classic Lunghi del Caro Bene." "What?" he said. I thought that he didn't understand my Italian, so I translated it for him. He used to tell me that he had gone around for a year, and every Negro would sing either Glory Road, Guina Heaven, or Old Man River, or some other Negro song. It was all right, but here comes this Negro singing an old Italian classic. But that's what I knew and what I loved. I wasn't putting on an act, I was being myself. I sang about 8 bars, and I was standing behind. He said, "Do you know this by heart?" "Yes, I know it," I said. "I want to look at your face when you sing." So I went around in the bow of the piano, and he played it and looked at me while I was singing. He had memorized it that quickly. I sang the same 8 bars, and he stopped. "Will you be my Porgy?" Well, I came back the following Sunday, and the whole board of the Theater Guild was there. I was supposed to sing 3 or 4 songs. I sang 30. I sang Negro spirituals, German lieder, French chansons. We had just a wonderful time. I sang an hour and a half. Then we had some drinks and a little food. He called Ira and his wife from across the street, and they came over. They got out Porgy and Bess, and he and Ira stood there with their awful voices and sang the whole score. When he started the opening music, I thought to myself, this kind of stinks. However, the more he played, the more beautiful I thought the music was. These beautiful melodies in this new idiom, it was something I had never heard. I just couldn't get enough. The year was 1924. Calvin Coolidge, Cool Cal, was in the White House. The year was 1924, and a 25-year-old male pilot had persuaded a group of St. Louis businessmen to finance the construction of a single-engine plane in San Diego that would be capable of flying the Atlantic. The year was 1924. Sears and Roebuck had opened their first retail store. The year was 1924, and the teachings of a Dayton, Ohio biology teacher by the name of John Scopes would eventually pit the legal talents of Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan in a struggle to define human evolution. The year was 1924, and George Gershwin tested the boundaries between jazz and classical music with his masterpiece, Rhapsody in Blue.